The static was a living thing in the Tactical Operations Center, a nest of snakes hissing through the speakers. On the main screen, a topographical map of the Zarin Valley glowed in shades of hostile red. 6 friendly icons, designated Trident 4, were pinned inside a tight contour cluster, unmoving. A creeping wall of emerald green, representing the inbound derecho storm system, was slowly devouring the western edge of the map. It was a digital pincer movement, with insurgents on the high ground and an act of God moving in to finish the job. "What's their ammunition status, Sergeant?" Colonel Hayes's voice cut through the tension like a shard of glass. He stood with his arms crossed, a man carved from institutional granite, his face illuminated by the cold blue light of the monitors. A young airman, his face pale, tapped at his console. "Trident lead reports black on 762, sir. Down to sidearms and 2 magazines of 556 each. They have 1 remaining claymore." Hayes's jaw tightened. Black on their main support weapon. It was a death sentence. And the enemy? Holding the ridgeline. At least 3 DSHK heavy machine gun positions, multiple RPG teams. They're just waiting. They know about the storm. They know our window is closed. The radio crackled again. The voice of Trident lead strained and thin, stretched across miles of unforgiving rock and enemy airwaves. "Havoc, this is Trident lead. Be advised, QRF is a no-go. We are digging in. Do you have an updated timeline on that weather cell?" Hayes took the microphone from the airman. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, a procedural finality that was more brutal than any curse. "Trident lead, this is Havoc actual. Negative. The storm front has accelerated. It's a 0-0 ceiling with extreme downburst potential. Air assets are grounded. I repeat, all birds are grounded. Extraction is not viable at this time." "Sir." "Colonel, that's not a timeline, that's a eulogy." The voice shot back, the static failing to scrub the raw desperation from the words. "They have us bracketed. We won't last an hour once that rain hits and they can move without air cover." "You have your orders, Lieutenant," Hayes said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Fortify your position. We will reevaluate post-storm." He clicked the microphone off. The hiss of static rushed back in to fill the void, louder than before. He turned to the assembled staff in the dimly lit command tent. "It's a catastrophic loss, but it's a controlled one. I will not send a rescue crew into a non-permissive flight environment to lose another dozen souls and a $30 million aircraft. It's too late. The book says it's too late." He looked around the room, daring anyone to challenge the cold, hard logic of the situation. No one did. The book was scripture in his army. The book kept people alive by knowing when to cut losses. The book said Trident 4 was already gone. Their icons on the screen just ghosts waiting to be erased. In the silence that followed, nobody noticed the quiet figure who had been standing at the back of the tent slip out into the roaring wind and driving rain. The declaration hung in the air of the TOC, thick and suffocating. "Extraction is not viable," Colonel Hayes had said it with the dispassionate certainty of a surgeon discussing a terminal diagnosis. He laid out the facts like instruments on a sterile tray. The derecho's leading edge was producing wind shear clocked at over 80 knots. The cloud ceiling in the Zarin Valley had dropped to less than 100 feet from the canyon floor, a thick, soupy mess that would blind any pilot, day or night. The enemy owned every dominant peak, every overhang, every natural firing position along the 5-mile ingress route. "Sending in a helicopter isn't a rescue," Hayes elaborated, his gaze sweeping over the grim faces of the command staff. "It's a sacrifice. You fly into that canyon, you're a pinball in a machine. The wind will slam you into a wall before the enemy even gets a shot off. And they will get a shot off. We're tracking multiple RPG-7s and at least one team suspected of carrying a Stinger. It's a textbook kill box." A young captain, a pilot himself, cleared his throat. "Sir, what about a low-level approach? If a pilot could stay under the ridgeline." "Under the ridgeline is where the wind shear is worst," Hayes countered instantly, pointing a stern finger at the anemometer readings on a secondary screen. "It's a wind tunnel. A tornado laid on its side. It would tear the rotor right off a Black Hawk. No one, he emphasized, his voice dropping to a low, authoritative growl, can fly in that. No one. The risk assessment is 0% probability of success. That's not a gamble. That's suicide. The comms channel from the valley remained open, a morbid courtesy. Trident Lead's breathing was audible, a ragged counterpoint to the colonel's pronouncements. "Havoc, we hear you," the voice said, stripped of its earlier fire, hollowed out by resignation. "We understand." The understanding was the most chilling part. They knew the math. They knew the book. They were soldiers. They knew what an acceptable loss looked like, and they were staring at it from the inside. Hayes nodded, satisfied that the grim reality had been accepted. "We'll direct drone surveillance as long as we can maintain a link. Document everything." It was the final procedural nail in the coffin. Document the loss for the after-action reports. He turned away from the main screen, his duty done. The decision was made logical and defensible. He had followed procedure and saved a flight crew from certain death. But as he looked at the faces of his staff, he saw no relief. He saw the same thing he felt but would never show. The bitter, metallic taste of failure dictated by insurmountable odds. The room was a tomb, the 6 glowing icons of Trident for the headstones. The book had been followed. The men were still going to die. The rain came down in sheets, drumming a frantic, warlike rhythm on the corrugated metal roof of Hangar 4. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of hydraulic fluid, ozone, and wet concrete. While the argument of impossibility was still settling in the TOC, Chief Warrant Officer for Anya Rostova was already halfway through her pre-flight checks. Her aircraft, an HH-60W Jolly Green II with the call sign Jolly September 1st, Saturday under the harsh sodium lights, its olive drab skin dark with moisture. It wasn't a standard bird. It was hers. Scars from shrapnel peppered the fuselage near the port-side gunner's window, each dent a story she never told. On the collective control inside the cockpit, the worn leather grip was molded perfectly to the shape of her hand from thousands of flight hours spent in conditions that would make other pilots refuse to even start their engines. Anya moved with an unhurried, silent grace that belied the fury of the storm outside and the desperation crackling over the radios. She wasn't in the TOC. She didn't need to be. She had been monitoring the tactical net on her personal headset, listening to the data, not the opinions. Wind shear, ceiling, threats. To Colonel Hayes, they were absolute barriers. To Anya, they were variables in a complex, high-stakes equation she was already solving. Her co-pilot, a young warrant officer named Michaels, watched her, his face a knot of anxiety. "Chief, you heard the colonel. The mission is a scrub. They grounded everyone." Anya didn't look up from the rotor hub she was inspecting, running a gloved hand over the massive bolts. "Hayes grounded the wing," she said, her voice low and calm. "He didn't ground me." She moved to the cockpit door and paused, her fingers tracing a small, barely visible symbol stenciled just inside the frame. A stylized raven with its wings spread, painted in a faded, ghostly white. A personal marking from a past life in a different, colder war. It was her reminder. She swung herself into the pilot's seat. The cockpit came to life around her, a familiar embrace of glowing screens and switches. Her movements were fluid, economical.
No wasted motion.
Power on. A PU engaged. The high-pitched whine began to build, a promise of the power to come. Her 2 crew chiefs, seasoned sergeants who had flown with her for years, were already loading belts into the miniguns, their movements mirroring her own quiet efficiency. They didn't ask if they were going. They just knew. Michaels strapped himself into the co-pilot seat. "The risk assessment," he started, but trailed off as Anya finally turned to look at him. Her eyes were pale gray, the color of a winter sky, and held a focus so intense it seemed to suck the air out of the cockpit. "The book says they're dead," she said simply, her gaze turning back to the instruments as the twin General Electric T-700 engines began to spool up, the whine deepening into a hungry roar. "The book is wrong." She keyed her helmet's microphone, bypassing the main command channel and speaking directly to the tower controller, a man who had seen her fly before. "Tower, this is Jolly 9-1. I'm taking off." There was a moment of stunned silence before a nervous voice crackled back. "Jolly 9-1, be advised. Airfield is red condition. All flight operations are suspended." Anya's hand was already on the collective. The massive rotor blades began to beat the heavy, rain-soaked air into submission. "Acknowledged," she said, and that was all. The helicopter shuddered, light on its wheels, straining against its own weight. The storm was waiting. So were the men in the valley. The moment Jolly 9-1 lifted off the tarmac, it was like being thrown into a washing machine full of rocks. The helicopter lurched violently, the furious wind of the derecho grabbing hold of it, trying to dash it back to the ground. Rain hammered against the armored windscreen with the force of thrown gravel, a deafening, relentless assault. Through her night vision goggles, the world outside was a swirling vortex of strobing green and black, a nightmare landscape with no horizon and no reference points. "Jesus Christ," Michaels muttered, his hands ghosting over his own set of controls. The colonel wasn't kidding. Anya didn't respond. Her entire being was focused on the machine, on the delicate, constant dance between the cyclic stick, the collective, and the anti-torque pedals. She wasn't fighting the storm. She was flowing with it, absorbing its violent energy and translating it into 1,000-minute corrections. Her arms and legs were a part of the aircraft's nervous system, feeling the strain on the rotor mast, the yaw of the tail, the sickening drop of a sudden downburst. In the TOC, a stunned silence had fallen. Jolly 9-1's icon had detached from the airfield on the main screen and was now crawling toward the red-soaked Zarin Valley. Colonel Hayes stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. "Who authorized that launch?" he demanded, his voice dangerously low. The tower controller's voice came over the local net, shaky but firm. "No authorization given, sir. She just took off. Get her on the horn. Order her to return to base immediately." Anya heard the call come through her secondary comms channel. "Jolly 9-1, this is Havoc Actual. You are ordered to abort. Return to base. Acknowledge." Her thumb hovered over the transmit button for a second, then moved away. She wasn't disobeying. She was simply prioritizing. Her focus was on the mouth of the canyon, a jagged, black maw that was now visible through the sheets of rain. The easy part was over. She pushed the nose down, trading altitude for speed, and dropped below the first ridgeline. The helicopter descended from the open chaos of the sky into the focused chaos of the canyon. Here, the wind didn't just buffet. It roared. It howled through the narrow stone passages, creating vicious crosswinds and unpredictable vertical drafts. The world shrank to a tight corridor of rock walls, slick with rain and rushing by in a terrifying, claustrophobic blur. Her NVGs painted the scene in an eerie, monochromatic glow. Every glistening rock, every stunted, windlash tree was a potential point of impact. "Altitude 100 feet, Michaels called out, his voice tight. 8 feet. 6. Anya held it there, skimming the churning, rock-strewn river that carved the canyon floor. The rotor wash whipped the water into a frenzy, a visible maelstrom of her own, making that followed them into the darkness. She was using the terrain itself as a shield, flying so low that anyone on the ridges above would have to fire almost straight down to hit her. She was a ghost in the storm, a whisper of rotor blades lost in the howl of the wind. She was in her element. She was hunting. The first sign of the enemy wasn't a flash, but a sound. A deep, rhythmic thump-thump-thump that managed to cut through the shriek of the turbines and the roar of the storm. It was the distinct, deadly chatter of a DSHK 127mm heavy machine gun. A split second later, a stream of green tracers tore through the darkness, stitching a line of incandescent death across the canyon wall just ahead and above them. "Contact! Ridgeline, 11 o'clock high," Michaels shouted, instinct taking over. In the TOC, the tactical display lit up. A new icon appeared, pulsing red. "Havoc, Trident lead, The voice from the ground crackled, a new urgency in it. We have enemy heavy gun engaging an unknown air asset in the canyon. Repeat, somebody is in the canyon. Colonel Hayes stared at the screen, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the console. The unknown asset was his disobedient pilot, flying directly into the teeth of the threat he had explicitly forbidden anyone to face. He expected to see her icon vanish in a bright, final flare. Anya saw the muzzle flashes, a string of brilliant, angry stars against the black rock. She didn't bank or swerve. Any sudden move in this wind could be fatal. Instead, her left thumb flicked a switch on the cyclic, arming the 275-inch rockets in the pod on her port stubwing. Her eyes, magnified by the NVG display, pinpointed the source of the fire. Her mind processed the range, the windage, the aircraft's forward momentum in a fraction of a second. She didn't salvo. That was for suppression, for panicked, desperate volume. This was for elimination. Her thumb depressed the firing stud twice in a quick, precise tap. Thump thump. 2 Hydra rockets streaked from their pods, their tiny motors burning fiercely for a moment before they vanished into the rain and darkness. There was no cinematic, screen-shaking explosion. Just a brief, intense flash on the ridge, a gout of rock dust and sparks, and then silence. The heavy machine gun stopped firing. On the ground, one of the SEALs, peering through his own thermal scope, lowered his weapon. "Holy shit!" he breathed into his comms. "Did you see that? 2 rounds right in the nest. The gun is gone." Trident Lead's voice was filled with a dawning, incredulous hope. "Havoc, be advised, enemy HMG is neutralized. Air asset scored a direct hit. Who the hell is flying that bird?" The young airman at the console in the TOC, who had been holding his breath, looked at his screen where the name associated with Jolly 9-1's transponder was displayed. He keyed his mic, his voice resonating with a sudden, quiet awe that filled the entire command center. "Trident Lead, that's no unknown asset," he said, the word tasting like legend on his tongue. "That's Valkyrie." The call sign hung in the air, imbued with a new and sudden weight. Colonel Hayes stood ramrod straight, his expression unreadable. The book was being torn apart, page by page, by a woman in a storm-tossed helicopter, 5 miles deep behind enemy lines. The destruction of the machine gun nest changed the dynamic of the fight. The insurgents on the ridges were no longer dealing with a lumbering transport helicopter blundering into their trap. They were facing a predator. The quiet confidence they'd had, waiting for the storm to mask their final assault, evaporated. In its place grew a frantic urgency. They had to kill this ghost before it reached the SEALs. The response was immediate and chaotic. Mortar tubes, previously silent, began to cough. Explosions blossomed in the canyon below, geysers of rock and muddy water erupting in Valkyrie's path. They weren't aiming for a direct hit, an impossibility against a fast-moving target in these conditions, but were attempting to create a wall of shrapnel, to force her up into the sky where other, more lethal threats were waiting. "Mortar impacts. 100 meters ahead," Michaels called out, his eyes scanning the terrain, calling out the flashes. 75 meters. They're walking them back toward us." "I see them," Anya replied, her voice a flat line of calm. She weaved the Black Hawk through the barrage, not with sharp, jarring turns, but with fluid, controlled shifts in momentum, like a skier navigating a slalom course. She made the multi-ton machine feel weightless, responsive, an extension of her own will. Then the real threat emerged. A new voice cut into the TOC's comms net, this one from a drone operator flying an MQ-9 Reaper high above the storm, its synthetic aperture radar peeling back the clouds. "Havoc, Reaper 1 has a new emitter, moving fast. We have a suspected Manpad's team moving to the overlook at Sector Gamma. They'll have a clear firing solution in 90 seconds. Colonel Hayes's face was now a study in rigid control. The dismissal was gone, replaced by the focused intensity of a commander who, against all his better judgment, was now fully committed to the battle playing out on his screens. His initial anger had been burned away by the pilot's impossible skill. He grabbed the microphone, Valkyrie, this is Havoc, he said, his voice clipped and precise. No more orders to return to base. He was her eye in the sky now. Be advised, confirmed Manpad's threat. You're 12 o'clock. On the eastern ridge, elevation approximately 200 feet above your current position. They are setting up now. Copy, Havoc. Anya's voice crackled back, betraying nothing. Visual on Sector Gamma. Inside the cockpit, a new tension settled. Miniguns and rockets were useless against a heat-seeking missile. Her crew chiefs swiveled their weapons toward the ridge, peering into the swirling green murk, knowing there was little they could do. Countermeasures set, Michaels confirmed, his hand hovering over the flare/chaff dispenser controls. They'll be waiting for us to climb, Anya said, more to herself than to her co-pilot. The mortars were designed to force her up. The Manpad's team was the hammer waiting for the anvil. It was a classic, well-executed trap. We can't stay this low forever, Chief, Michael said, stating the obvious. The canyon was getting narrower, the riverbed more treacherous. We won't, Anya said. Her eyes flickered across her displays. Airspeed, torque, altitude, wind speed. The variables were all there. The solution was insane. It was the only one she had. Strap in, she ordered. Her tone was no different than if she were ordering coffee. I'm putting us on the deck. The phrase on the deck was an understatement. What Anya did next was a violation of physics, a rejection of every known flight regulation and safety protocol. She pushed the cyclic stick forward, dumping the collective, and plunged Jolly 9 to 1 into the churning river below. Not into the water, but into the space just above it. The helicopter's landing gear skimmed the whitecaps, the rotor wash blasting the river into a V-shaped wake behind them like a speedboat. The canyon walls, now impossibly close, became a solid blur of wet, glistening rock. They were no longer flying through the canyon. They were a part of it, a screaming, mechanical projectile fired down its length. Airspeed 200 knots. Michaels yelled over the engine's tortured scream, his voice a mixture of terror and exhilaration. Rotor RPM at 105%. Christ, Anya, the walls. He didn't need to say it. The tips of the rotor blades were scything the air just feet from the stone on either side. A single miscalculation, a sudden gust of wind she couldn't compensate for, would result in their immediate, violent atomization. In the TOC, the drone feed struggled to keep up. The image was a shaky, low-resolution smear of green and gray. All they could truly track was her transponder icon, moving at a speed that seemed impossible for a helicopter in that environment. Colonel Hayes leaned forward, his eyes locked on the screen, his breath held. He had seen daring pilots before. He had seen cowboys. This was something else entirely. This was a form of communion between a pilot and her machine, an expression of total, absolute mastery. The Manpad's team on the ridge was ready. Through his thermal sight, the gunner saw the helicopter's heat signature approaching. It was low, impossibly low, but it would have to climb to clear the rockfall at the next bend. He hefted the launcher onto his shoulder, felt the seeker head lock on with a satisfying tone, and prepared to fire the moment the aircraft presented its vulnerable belly. But Anya never climbed. As she approached the bend, a sharp 90-degree turn in the canyon, she did something that defied all logic. Instead of slowing to navigate the turn, she accelerated. At the last possible second, she hauled the helicopter into a brutal, high-G bank, throwing it practically sideways. For a terrifying moment, the aircraft was flying with its rotors oriented vertically, the left side door gunner staring straight down at the river, the right side gunner looking up at the sky. The turn was so violent it almost tore the aircraft apart. Alarms shrieked in the cockpit. But it worked. She used the solid rock of the canyon's inner wall as a shield, hugging the turn so tightly that by the time she shot out the other side, she was already past the Manpad's team's firing azimuth. The gunner on the ridge cursed, swinging the heavy launcher, trying to reacquire a lock. It was too late. All he saw was the tail of the Black Hawk disappearing into the rain and darkness, its engines echoing off the walls. He hadn't even been able to get a shot off. In the cockpit, as Anya leveled them out, Michaels let out a shaky, gasping laugh. I think I'm gonna be sick. Anya's knuckles were white on the controls, the only outward sign of the immense strain. Almost there, she said, her voice still impossibly steady. Call the Tridents. Tell them to get ready to move. The LZ wasn't an LZ. It was a narrow, slanted slab of rock barely wider than the helicopter's fuselage, slick with rain and pounded by enemy fire. Below it, a sheer drop of 200 feet to the raging river. Above it, the cliffs from which insurgents were pouring down sporadic but effective RPG and machine gun fire. Trident 4 was huddled behind a series of miserable-looking boulders, their position becoming more untenable by the second. Jolly 9-1, this is Trident Lead. We see you. LZ is hot. I repeat, LZ is hot. Copy, Trident. Anya's voice crackled back, a beacon of calm in the maelstrom. We'll make it work. On my mark, pop smoke. There was no room to land, no way to set down completely. Anya brought Jolly 9-1 into a hover, a feat of impossible stability in the swirling winds. The mortars were still falling, closer now, bracketing their position. An RPG streaked past the nose, exploding against the far canyon wall with a deafening crack. Pop smoke now. A purple cloud billowed from the SEAL's position, a vibrant splash of color in the grim, green-hued world of night vision. It was the signal. It was also a target. The enemy fire intensified, converging on the smoke. Anya didn't flinch. She nudged the cyclic forward, inching the Black Hawk toward the ledge. The two crew chiefs behind her opened up with their GU 1850 caliber machine guns, the heavy weapons pounding out a deafening rhythm, laying down a wall of lead that chewed up the rocks where the enemy fire was originating. She brought the aircraft in until its left side landing wheel crunched onto the edge of the rock. The other wheel remained suspended over the abyss. It was a terrifyingly precarious perch, a balancing act requiring constant, microscopic adjustments to the controls to keep the multi-ton machine from either tipping into the cliff face or sliding off into the darkness below. Go, 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 she transmitted. The SEALs broke cover, moving with the desperate speed of men who had been staring death in the face for hours. They scrambled toward the open door of the helicopter, low-crawling across the exposed rock as rounds sparked and ricocheted around them. Anya held the hover steady, her entire focus narrowed to the pressure in her hand, the feedback from the rotors, the subtle shifts of the wind. The helicopter groaned under the strain, a living creature in agony, held in place only by her will. The first SEAL tumbled in, then the second and the third hauled inside by the crew chiefs. An RPG exploded on the rock face just above the cockpit, showering the aircraft with stone fragments. The windscreen crazed but held. Two more! A crew chief yelled over the intercom. Anya saw a muzzle flash from a cave high on the cliff. A new threat. She couldn't use her own rockets. The splash damage was too close to the SEALs. Right gunner. Cave. 10 o'clock high. The 50 calories swung around, spitting a torrent of tracers that hammered into the dark opening, silencing the threat. The last two SEALs were aboard. The team leader, the last one in, slapped the floor of the helicopter twice. Trident is secure. Go, go, go. Anya didn't need to be told twice. She pulled back on the collective, the engine screaming as they took the full weight of the aircraft and its new passengers. For a heart-stopping moment, the Black Hawk dipped toward the canyon floor before the rotors bit into the heavy air and clawed for altitude. She banked hard, away from the ledge, and plunged back into the storm-lashed corridor, flying out the same impossible way she had come in. The silence in the Tactical Operations Center was absolute, a profound, breathless vacuum that had replaced the earlier tension. Every eye was fixed on the main screen, the 6 red icons of Trident, for were now safely enclosed within the single blue icon of Jolly 9-1, moving steadily, inexorably, away from the Zarin Valley kill box. The icon wasn't just a tactical marker anymore. It was a symbol of a miracle. The young airman who had first named Valkyrie stared at the screen, his mouth slightly agape. He had witnessed something that would be told in hushed, reverent tones in flight hangars and chow halls for years to come. It was the birth of a legend, broadcast in real time. Colonel Hayes stood apart from the others, his posture as rigid as ever, but something had fundamentally shifted in his demeanor. The rigid certainty of the by-the-book commander had been shattered, replaced by the stunned awe of a professional who had just seen the outer limits of his profession redefined. He had watched a pilot take an equation with a 0% probability of success and solve it through sheer, unimaginable talent and will. He had declared it too late, and she had single-handedly turned back the clock. He watched her icon clear the canyon mouth and begin its slow, labored climb over the mountains. He knew the aircraft would be damaged, low on fuel, the crew and passengers pushed to their absolute limits. He raised the microphone to his lips, his thumb hesitating for a fraction of a second. The entire room seemed to lean in, waiting to hear what he would say. His voice, when it came, was stripped of all its previous skepticism. It was flat, professional, but underpinned by a new, unfamiliar current of respect. Jolly 9-1, be advised. Tanker is on station for your return leg at Checkpoint Alpha. Medical is standing by at the field. Good work, he paused. Then added the two words that signified a total reversal, a complete capitulation to the reality of what he had just witnessed. Godspeed, Valkyrie. It was the first time he had used her call sign. The word was an admission, an apology, an anointing. He lowered the microphone and turned to the young airman whose awe had not yet subsided. "Sergeant," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Update Chief Warrant Officer Rostova's flight record." He looked back at the screen one last time, at the blue icon safely on its way home. Note, exceptional performance under extreme combat conditions. And add a personal commendation. "From me." The airman nodded, his fingers flying across the keyboard, typing the words that would officially enter the event into the cold, factual annals of military history. But everyone in that room knew the truth was far greater than any report could ever capture. They had seen the book of rules torn to shreds, and they had seen what rose from its ashes. The rain had softened to a persistent, dreary drizzle by the time Jolly 9-1 settled onto the rain-slicked tarmac. The landing was feather-light, a final, gentle defiance of the brutal forces the aircraft had endured. As the twin engines spooled down with a series of deep, shuddering sighs, the ground crew swarmed the helicopter, their headlamps cutting beams through the misty darkness. The side door slid open and the members of Trident 4 emerged. They were not the cocky, elite warriors of recruitment posters. They were ghosts, covered in mud and grime, their faces etched with exhaustion and the haunting proximity of death. They moved stiffly, carrying their wounded, their movements slow and deliberate. They were alive, and they knew exactly who to thank. Anya Rostova completed her shutdown sequence, the cockpit lights blinking off one by one until only the dim emergency lighting remained. She unstrapped herself and moved with a weary grace that spoke of deep fatigue, not of bones, but of the spirit. She did her post-flight walk-around, her gloved hand running over the fuselage. The aircraft was a mess. The windscreen was a spiderweb of cracks. New pockmarks from shrapnel and small arms fire peppered its skin. A long, ugly gash ran along the belly where she had skimmed a rock in the riverbed. The machine was wounded, but it had brought them all home. As she rounded the tail boom, she saw the SEAL team leader waiting for her. He was a large man, a giant even without his full combat load, his face a mask of camo paint, sweat, and rain. He stood silently, watching her. The rest of his team had stopped a few paces behind him, a silent, battered honor guard. No words were exchanged. In their world, in the aftermath of what they had just shared, words were clumsy, inadequate things. He simply looked at her, his gaze intense, traveling from her face to the battered helicopter, then back again. He understood the language of action, of risk, of impossible odds overcome. In his eyes, she saw a depth of gratitude and respect that no medal or citation could ever convey. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a small gesture, but it was freighted with meaning. A warrior's salute from one professional to another, an acknowledgement of a debt that could never truly be repaid. Anya, wiping a smear of grease from her cheek with the back of her hand, met his gaze and returned the nod with one of her own. It was all that was needed. The SEAL leader turned and led his men toward the debriefing rooms and the waiting medics. Anya watched them go, then turned back to her aircraft. The rotors drooped in the damp air, ticking softly as the hot metal cooled. She reached out and laid her palm flat against the cold, wet skin of the fuselage, just below the pilot's side window where her name was stenciled. CW-4A, Rostova. Below it, the faded, almost invisible painting of the Raven. The hangar lights cast a lonely glow on the scene. There was no cheering crowd, no ceremony. There was only the quiet pilot, her wounded machine, and the silent, profound respect earned in the heart of a storm, in a place the book said no one could go.